Is this thing on? Good. Check the floorboards.
Marilyn, the architect of her own invention. Welcome to our third voyage of our February series. We are moving from the high-voltage suburban tragedy of Clara Harris into the blinding, clandestine neon of Hollywood. We're going to strip away the dumb blonde junk show and look at the academic brilliance of a woman who built a goddess out of the wreckage of an orphan. The birth of a ghost. Close your eyes and feel the stagnant, oily heat of a 1944 California munitions factory. The air is a thick soup of dope, solvent, and the metallic tang of wartime industry. In the middle of this high-voltage junk show, a young woman named Norma Jeane Mortenson is busy spraying down airplane fuselages. She isn't a star. She is a clandestine figure in a denim jumpsuit, just another cog in the machine of the Second World War. But when a military photographer makes landfall at the factory to snap Rosie the Riveter types for Yank magazine, the engine of history is officially jump-started. Norma Jeane didn't just step into the frame. She colonized it. The photographer noticed that the lens didn't just capture her. It seemed to deep dive into her very soul. Before we chart the course of her transformation, you might recall our recent investigation into Clara Harris. Both women lived lives that were high-voltage narratives of public fascination. But where Clara's story ended in a sudden, violent scuttling of her dream, Norma Jeane's story was a slow, academic construction of a persona that would eventually swallow her whole. She was about to leave the safety of her first marriage and sail into the murky, predatory waters of the Hollywood studio system. The construction of a goddess. To understand the icon, you have to look at the atavistic wreckage of her childhood. Norma Jeane was a girl of foster homes and clandestine trauma. A child who learned early on that the world was a junk show where you had to batten down the hatches just to survive. When she signed with 20th Century Fox, she realized that Norma Jeane just wasn't enough to survive the sharks. So she began an academic study of her own image. She dyed her hair pillowcase white. She practiced the breathless voice to hide a childhood stutter. And she meticulously crafted the Marilyn walk, a high-voltage sway allegedly achieved by shaving a quarter-inch off one heel of her shoes. This wasn't luck. It was engineering. While the public saw a dumb blonde, the reality was that Marilyn was a devotee of the method. She traveled to New York to study under Lee Strasberg, deep diving into the psychological grit of acting to prove she wasn't just a pinup like Betty Page. She was reading James Joyce and Dostoevsky while the studio bosses tried to keep her in the junk show of musical comedies. She was an intellectual trapped in a body that the world had ratified as public property, and the friction between those two identities was starting to create a gale force storm. Scuttling the studio system. By the mid-1950s, Marilyn was tired of being a passenger on her own ship. The studio bosses at Fox treated her like just another asset, paying her a fraction of what her male co-stars made while her films brought in high-voltage profits. In a move that absolutely scuttled the traditional Hollywood power structure, Marilyn did the unthinkable. She sashayed away. She ran to New York and founded Marilyn Monroe Productions. It was a high-low mix of high-stakes business and personal rebellion that the industry had never seen from a woman before. The Rat Pack of that era didn't know what to make of it. She wasn't just a pretty face in a calendar anymore. She was a captain. She fought the crazy contracts and kept actors in virtual servitude and made landfall back in Hollywood with a new deal that gave her creative control and a pretty good pay raise. She had jump-started a new era for female performers, proving that you could be the most desired woman in the world and still be the one with your hand on the tiller. But as her professional life hit its stride, her personal life was becoming a narrative disaster of high-voltage proportions. Mid-voyage supply drop. As we watch Marilyn navigate the treacherous currents of 1950s fame, we need to pause for a quick supply drop. Uncovering the salt and the factual grit of icons like Marilyn, stripping away the Hollywood junk show to find the woman underneath. That takes a massive amount of fuel. If you happen to be finding value in these detailed sagas, consider joining our Patreon crew. It's the fuel that keeps the history rat scurrying into the clandestine archives to bring you the truth behind the airbrushed photos. Your support ensures we don't have to scuttle the depths of these stories for the sake of a shorter video. And while you're out checking the charts at the port of Patreon, why not make sure the ship is ship-shape here at the YouTube dock by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It's the easiest way for the crew to keep the algorithm gods in our favor and ensure we stay on course for our next voyage. Every subscription is a signal flare that tells the world, and YouTube, that the Rat Pack wants real academic history, told with a bit of garage talk soul. Now, let's head back into the 1960s, where the clandestine connections to the highest offices in the land began to take a high-voltage turn. The Kennedy Connection. The 1960s brought Marilyn into the orbit of the most high-voltage family in American history, the Kennedys. The academic record of her relationship with JFK and RFK, respectively, is a ship with more holes than a sieve, filled with clandestine whisperers and missing diary pages.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Mr. President. Happy birthday to you.
Her performance of Happy Birthday, Mr. President at Madison Square Garden wasn't just a song. It was a high-voltage cultural moment that felt like a public confession. She was draped in a dress so tight it had to be sewn onto her, literally. A beautiful masterpiece that hid the junk show of her crumbling mental health. The salt of the story is that Marilyn was becoming too high voltage for the clandestine world of Washington, D.C. She was a woman who knew too much, who had made landfall in the lives of the most powerful men in the world. As her film career began to scuttle under the weight of her dependencies and her clandestine struggles with the studio on the set of Something's Got to Give, the gales were closing in. She was no longer just an actress. She was a high-stakes liability in a political junk show that was about to reach a breaking point. Myth versus reality, the Brentwood departure. Let's dive into the fact and fiction of that final human night in August 1962. The myth. Marilyn was a clandestine hit ordered by the mob or the CIA to protect the Kennedy brothers from high-voltage scandal. The reality? While the evidence of missing phone logs and the suspicious timeline of her doctor's arrival does suggest some sort of cover-up, the most likely reality is a tragic accidental overdose, fueled by years of internal suffering. I really don't think that she wanted to scuttle her own ship. I truly believe she wanted to find a harbor where the voices of the studio bosses and the politicians would finally just shut up. The myth. She died alone and unloved, a faded star who had hit the rocks. The reality? Marilyn was at the peak of her creative powers, planning new films and preparing to jumpstart her production company again. She wasn't a junk show wreckage. She was a woman in the middle of an academic pivot, trying to reinvent herself and the world around her. The tragedy wasn't that she had failed, but that the high-voltage pressure of her own invention had finally scuttled the engine. The legacy of a self-made goddess. Marilyn Monroe passed away at 36, but the ship she built is still sailing. She remains the ultimate atavistic icon of the 20th century, a woman who proved that you could take the salt and the grit of a clandestine childhood and build a shiny-side-up empire. She wasn't a victim of the dumb blonde myth. She was the one who used that myth to jumpstart her own landfall in history. She taught the world that the architect is just as important as the building, and she battened down the hatches on her own legacy before the world could scuttle it. She left behind a trail of high-voltage influence that stretches from the halls of academia to the garage walls of the Rat Pack. She was the blueprint for the modern celebrity, the woman who realized that in the junk show of fame, the only way to survive is to be the one who draws the blueprints. She was real. She was messy. And she was absolutely beautiful until the very end, leaving us all with a factual saga that remains as high voltage today as it was in 1962. The redhead on the horizon. As we drop anchor on the saga of the platinum icon, take a breath. We've traveled from the jet black bangs of Betty Page to the white-hot fame of Marilyn. But next week, we're moving away from the manufactured perfection of Hollywood to meet a woman who was the total opposite. We're deep diving into the life of the most relatable pinup in history. The big girl who didn't care about the clandestine studio rules. We're going to be talking about the woman who proved that a round belly and a dimpled knee could be just as high voltage as a starlit silhouette. We're making landfall on the story of Hilda. You're not going to want to miss the finale of our February arc. Before you head out, make sure the ship is shipshape. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next horizon. Until next time, fair winds and following seas, my friends. Be good to each other. Make good choices. Be good in school. Listen to your teachers and do your homework. And call your dadgum mama. It won't kill you.
The kings were cruel.